The year was 1929, and the world was humming with confidence. Imagine standing on a New York avenue, morning light glancing off polished cars. Streetcars rattle by. Men in fedoras read newspapers, and the air smells of coffee, fresh ink, and perfume, the scent of a world that believes it has conquered time itself. From open windows, the syncopated rhythm of jazz spills out. This was the roaring 20s. Progress felt inevitable. Cities bloomed like promises. In Chicago, skyscrapers climbed into the clouds. In Detroit, assembly lines churned out cars with mechanical grace. On Wall Street, men spoke a new language. Numbers, speed, and belief. It was a dazzling decade where the future felt like it had already arrived. At night, cities glowed with electric light. Neon signs flickered over dance halls where couples moved to the rhythm of a saxophone, their dreams floating on champagne bubbles. For a brief, golden moment, the modern world felt immortal. But beneath the laughter, something delicate began to tremble. A quiet fracture running through the floorboards of faith. It started with a whisper, a hesitation on the trading floor. Then came October 24th, 1929, Black Thursday. A single stock dipped, then another, and another, until the ticker tape trembled with panic. The floor of the New York Stock Exchange erupted in a storm of shouting and flying paper. In a few hours, fortunes built on belief vanished like dust. The music faded. The bright machine of prosperity coughed, sputtered, and fell silent. The crash wasn't just a single day. It was a season of realization. Savings evaporated, chubs were lost, and the grand dream of endless prosperity dissolved like mist. The 1930s arrived not with fireworks, but with hunger. Across the heartland, wheat fields turned to dust, and wind rolled over the plains in great brown waves. Insidious men stood in bread lines that stretched around corners. The rich melodies of the 20s were gone, replaced by the rhythm of footsteps and silence. Yet, in that silence, dignity persisted. Neighbors shared what they had. Farmers traded eggs for cloth, ope for ope. America bent, but it did not break. President Roosevelt's calm voice filled living rooms, promising, "We will rise again." And slowly, people believed him. Artists painted truth. Writers filled notebooks with courage, and photographers captured faces lined with endurance portraits of strength, not despair. The decade that began in darkness learned to find meaning in shadow. Factories roared back to life, powered not by endless wealth, but by human resilience. We learned that markets could fail, but communities could endure. That progress meant nothing without compassion. The Great Depression didn't end a civilization. It reminded it how to survive. So when you walk through a modern city, remember the fragile courage of those who faced the silence and still chose to dream. They rebuilt the world not with riches, but with resolve. It seemed, for a moment, that the whole world had finally learned how to dance. Cities pulsed with a new kind of rhythm, not of nature, but of human invention. Engines, typewriters, radios, and saxophones all wove together into a single, mechanical heartbeat. Electric lights shimmered across windows like captured stars. Somewhere, a phonograph whispered a slow waltz, and in another room, someone was laughing the kind of pure, unbridled laughter that only comes when people truly believe nothing can go wrong. This was the age of ambition, and New York was its cathedral. Automobiles hummed down Fifth Avenue, their chrome catching the sunlight like silver blades. Women in feathered hats and sequined gowns stepped out of taxis with champagne smiles. Men in tailored suits, slick hair, gold watches spoke of stocks, of futures, of fortunes so vast they sounded like myths. Everywhere, a soft golden light seemed to say, "The future has arrived." Factories roared through the night, their smokestacks painting the sky in silver-gray ribbons. Elevators climbed through the steel skeletons of skyscrapers, not yet finished and yet already higher than imagination itself. The radio spoke to millions at once, its warm hum binding cities and farms alike. And an invisible web of sound. The airplane, once a dream, now stitched continents together in mere hours. And the movies, oh, the movies flickered like portals to another world. This was the decade when reality began to feel enchanted, when every new invention felt like a small miracle. They called it the Roaring Twenties, and it roared not with lions, but with laughter, brass, and the electric hum of hope. The air itself seemed charged with music, jazz-born from struggle, forged in smoky clubs, and midnight streets became the anthem of an age. Every note was freedom. Every trumpet flare was defiance. It was rebellion dressed in rhythm, and it spread like fire. Dancers filled the floors of Harlem and Chicago, their shoes tapping out stories older than any empire. A saxophone bent time itself. A trumpet cut through the dark, and for a few shining years, it felt like humanity had outsmarted sorrow. People believed the market could only rise, that wealth was infinite, that history itself had changed its rules. By now, sol literit always goes up, they said. Bankers spoke of prosperity as if it were a law of physics. Families bought stocks like souvenir tokens of a dream no one thought could end, and beneath the glitter, there was something deeper. A collective faith in progress so pure it almost felt sacred. But faith, even in the modern world, is a fragile thing. Somewhere, behind the champagne and applause, the numbers stopped making sense. Factories were producing more than people could buy. Banks were lending more than they possessed. Fortunes were being built not on steel or sweat, but on paper on. Speculex and on dreams stacked atop dreams. No one noticed the cracks at first. Why would they? The streets still sparkled. The music still played, but the clock was ticking. October 29th, 1929. Dawn crept across Wall Street like any other morning. No one yet knew that history had taken a breath and was about to exhale. By noon, the confident stride of traders was gone, replaced by an anxious shuffle. Sell, someone whispered. Then another voice, louder this time. Sell everything. And so, the roar began not of celebration, but of collapse. The invisible thread that held the modern world trusted snapped. It happened quietly, then all at once, the rhythm of progress fell into stillness. Banks shuddered. Factories slowed. The golden light dimmed, replaced by the gray of uncertainty. Across the continent, the echo of that fall rolled like distant thunder. Farmers watched their land turn to dust. Families packed everything into rusted cars, chasing rumors of work that did not exist. The laughter that once filled the air was replaced by a silence too heavy to name. It wasn't just money that vanished that day. It was fate. Faith in the system, in certainty, in the idea that progress was permanent. But in that stillness, something tender began to grow. Neighbors shared bread. Strangers left coins on doorsteps. Music changed slower, sadder, but somehow more honest. People learned again the ancient lesson that no machine, no market, and no dream of wealth can replace the simple pulse of human kindness. From the dust of the Depression rose new ideas, banking reforms, social safety nets, and the understanding that progress requires not just ambition, but care. And maybe that was the true inheritance of the age. Not the rise, but the reckoning. Because only when the music stopped did humanity remember the value of quiet. So remember, there was a time when the world forgot to pause. And yet, even then, the universe whispered the same truth it always has. Everything moves in cycles. Light, dark, rise, fall, silence, and song. The city sleeps beneath a gauze of mist. Street lamps shimmer against the fog, their light trembling on rain-darkened stone. Somewhere, far off, a clock tower tolls slow, patient, resigned. And in that hollow sound, the pulse of an era fades. The year is 1929. New York stands still, like a photograph left too long in the darkroom. Paper lies scattered along Wall Street, the ghostly confetti of a vanished celebration. A ticker tape curls by the curb, whispering the fragments of numbers that once meant everything now. Only ash and ink. You can almost hear its echo of the crowd that once gathered here. The men in bowler hats, collars crisp and eyes bright with belief. There was laughter then, a kind of music only cities make when they think they are invincibly. But tonight, it's gone. The laughter, the motion, the golden hum. Only the sound of a single window closing, somewhere above the fog. Before the silence came, the song, and what a song it was. The world had never danced like this before. Automobiles rolled like silver dreams down new concrete rivers. The streets sparkled with neon, reflected in the polished chrome of 1,000 new beginnings. And read stock numbers the way poets once read love letters, convinced they were glimpsing the language of the future. The women, dressed in sequins and laughter, danced to the wild, glittering defiance of jazz. It felt endless. The rhythm of the roaring 20s, a heartbeat shared by every crowded room, every glass raised to the sky. Prosperity, the papers called it. The new normal, the broker said, and people believed them. But somewhere beneath the melody, a quieter, colder rhythm began to whisper. The factories were making more than anyone could buy. The farmers were growing more than anyone could afford. And the numbers, those sacred lines of ink that once seemed to sing, started to twist. Just a correction, some said. The word crash still felt impossible, like something from an old story. Not this glittering new century, but behind the champagne and applause, the illusion was already cracking. Then came the morning of October 29th, 1929. Wall Street awoke to a silence that felt wrong, too deep, too heavy. By noon, the crowds had gathered, men in fine coats pressed against the marble walls, their faces pale, their hands trembling. Inside the exchange, the air was thick with panic. Sell orders multiplied like a storm of locusts. The numbers on the board tumbled down faster than anyone could speak them aloud. The market that had promised forever collapsed in a single, impossible breath. It wasn't just money that vanished that day. It was faith, an invisible thread that held the modern world together. And just like that, the song ended. The Great Depression had begun. The morning after was gray. Not dramatic, not stormy, only gray, like the world had forgotten to breathe. The headlines whispered, "Markets collapse, millions lost, no one yet knew how long the uncertainty would last." The crash was not an explosion. It was a slow unweaving, as threads of credit and confidence quietly snapped. In small towns, shopkeepers lowered their blinds. In cities, the breadlines began. Men who once owned buildings now waited for a bowl of soup, all equal in hunger, equal in silence. Yet, within that silence, something remarkable stirred. The glitter of the 20s had been bright but fragile. Now, a softer kind of strength took its place. Neighbors shared what they had: a loaf of bread, a coat, a story. This wasn't the strength of wealth. It was the strength of endurance, a quieter faith, not in markets, but in one another. On the plains, the land itself turned against its people in the Dust Bowl. Black blizzards of dust swallowed towns whole, forcing families to flee west toward California, pilgrims of survival crossing a broken land. Slowly, life began to return. New Deal programs put hands back to work. The sound of hammers and saws was music again, a rhythm to replace the despair. The world that had fallen apart began to piece itself together, not through fortune, but through faith in the quiet resilience that had always been there, buried beneath the glitter. By the end of the decade, the laughter had not yet returned, but the silence was full of lessons and scars. The people who survived carried its echo all their lives, a reminder that the world can crumble and still, somehow, keep breathing. That is the legacy of the Roaring '20s, not just the golden jazz, but the rebirth that followed. Every crash, every silence, is only the space between one song ending and another beginning. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey through time. The Great Depression did not stop at America's shores. It traveled silently across oceans, hidden inside numbers and debts, inside ships and telegrams, inside the thin pages of ledgers that no longer balanced. Over the Atlantic, ships moved slower now, their cargo holds half empty, their captains reading telegrams marked urgent and unpaid. Dockhands waited by crates that would never be lifted, and in the harbors, gulls circled above waters that smelled of rust and uncertainty. What began as a crash of paper and panic in New York became a storm that no map could contain. In London, the markets opened late. The crowds thinned. Minds that once fed the Empire's engines now stood in shadow. Men who had built ships and bridges now stood idle beside the gates they once walked through with pride. In Paris, the cafes stayed open, but laughter no longer reached the street. Painters still painted. Poets still wrote, but their words grew softer, their colors colder. And then, Germany. The Weimar Republic, already cracked from the weight of war and reparations, began to fracture. Inflation rose like a fever. A loaf of bread cost a day's wage, then a week's, then a month's. Money became worthless paper, fluttering in gutters like autumn leaves. In Berlin, a child sold matches under flickering lamps. A street musician played a violin with 3 strings to an audience who could not spare a coin, but stood anyway, listening. Across Europe, Pifia became a language everyone understood. In the smoky corners of beer halls, new voices rose louder, angrier, blaming, dividing, offering pride instead of bread. The music of democracy faded. In its place came the rhythm of boots. The Depression had not merely emptied pockets, it had emptied faith. Everywhere, the same silent trade was made. Freedom for certainty. When the ground shakes beneath your life, you cling to anyone who promises solid earth, even if it's built on lies. The Great Depression did not recognize borders. In Japan, silk traders watched their warehouses fill with goods no one could buy. In India, farmers starved, while ships carried their grain abroad. In Australia, men rode freight trains across red deserts, searching for towns that might still need them. For the first time, the world realized how tightly its fate was bound together. The Depression was more than an economic collapse. It was a revelation of painful awareness of humanity's fragile connection. We had built a world that could share success instantly, and discovered, too late, that it could share suffering just as fast. Batevent and Hook traveled in small envelopes, filled with trembling words. We're still here. We'll rebuild. Don't give up. The world had broken, but in its breaking, it had finally realized it was won. History would remember the Great Depression not only for what it destroyed, but for what it awakened. It taught us that no wall, no ocean, no flag can isolate us from the tremors of another's fall. And somewhere, in the quiet between storms, the world held its breath, waiting for dawn, unaware of how dark the next night would be. The wind had grown heavier now. It didn't sing anymore. It pressed. Across Europe, the quiet that once hung like dust over the ruins of the Depression began to tremble. It wasn't a thunderclap that woke the world, but a distant murmur of vengeance, a shiver of boots on cobblestone, a sigh that spread across borders faster than trains. You can almost hear it, can't you? The sound of factories roaring to life after years of silence. Steel returning to life. Paper orders stamped by sleepless clerks in smoky rooms. A continent stirring, not in joy but in preparation. In Germany, the night was lit by the glow of torches again. Flags unfurled across plazas where, not long ago, bread lines had stretched in quiet despair. And somewhere, a voice on the radio promised destiny, certainty, and restoration. The words were sharp, but the rhythm was almost musical, a lullaby for a nation that wanted to stop thinking and stop fearing. If you stood in Berlin that autumn, you would have seen it, the strange stillness before momentum. Streets swept clean, soldiers drilling beneath the gray October sky, mothers watching from windows, half proud, half terrified. The sound of boots like a heartbeat, steady, relentless, rehearsed. And in that perfect order, there was something almost hypnotic. The world didn't yet understand that the silence had already broken. Because silence is never truly empty. It carries within it the echo of what comes next. Across the English Channel, the air tasted of dread and cigarette smoke. Radios flickered in narrow London flats. Men in worn suits read headlines with tired eyes. Negotiations fail. Demands increase. Mobilization begins. Words that felt like rain steady, inevitable, impersonal. But in the cafes, in the corners of the world that had not yet burned, there were still voices that hoped. Young writers, dreamers, Students, their fingers inked, their hearts still full of the idea that reason could save everything. They were wrong, of course, but in their error, there was beauty. Because to believe, even when all logic says not to, that is what keeps the human story alive. And then came September 1st, 1939. The maps weren't ready for it. The world wasn't ready for it. But the tanks moved, and the planes rose, and the cities woke to sirens. Warsaw once, a city of poets and markets, became a maze of smoke and rubble. The quiet cracked open like glass under heat. The sky itself seemed to scream. The silence was gone. The world had entered its second fall from grace. Yet, within the horror, there was a rhythm again, a strange, dreadful rhythm that historians later called mobilization, but that people living through it called simply life. Factory whistles marked the hours. Mothers learned to ration. Men who once fixed clocks or sold books now carried rifles. And yet amid all that movement, something ancient stirred. The quiet, stubborn will to survive. Britain's nights became long. Overhead, searchlights carved slow paths through smoky skies. Children slept in subway tunnels. And yet, somehow, there was calm between the bombings. In those stolen hours, someone would strike a match, pour tea, whisper a story. Even in war, the soul looks for lullabies. Meanwhile, across the ocean, the United States watched half awake, half dreaming as Europe burned. The Great Depression had scarred its spirit, but not yet broken its distance. Men in Washington argued. Men in factories listened to radios, wondering if the ocean was wide enough to protect them from history. It wasn't. Because silence travels farther than sound, and when it finally breaks, the echo reaches everyone. By 1941, the storm that began in Europe had crossed oceans. The silence, once broken, had turned to a roar. And yet, within that roar, a new idea began to form, that from all this suffering, something different might rise. Not empire, not revenge, but unity. The world did not know it yet, but this was the breaking before the dawn. You see, every great silence in history, every collapse, every tragedy is followed by the smallest sound, a breath, a word, a song. That is how civilizations remember who they are. And so, when the bombs finally stopped falling, when the ash settled over broken streets, people began to build again, brick by brick, hand by hand, dream by dream. They planted gardens where craters had been. They raised schools in the shells of burned churches. The Great Depression had emptied their pockets. The war had emptied their hearts. But what remained, what always remains, was the quiet, relentless pulse of humanity. A mother's lullaby in a city without roofs. A baker giving his last loaf away. A soldier coming home to nothing and still smiling. These are not just stories. They are the foundation of the world we live in. From the dust of the 1930s and the fire of the early 1940s, a new world rose, fragile, wiser, and more human. It stumbled, but it rose, because the truth of this era is not only about failure or power. It is about endurance. It is about what people do when there is nothing left to hold on to but each other. Thank you for walking this quiet path through history with me. If this story moved you, please subscribe and share which moment stayed with you the most in the comments below. Rest well, and remember, the world may fall, but humanity always finds a way to stand again.